The third question is the future of the ICC. How do you think it's going to last? I mean, with all due respect, but how is it going to last without some enforcement mechanisms and then some kind of connection to the UN? There's no enforcement right now, right?
Well, go ahead. I have an answer.
The ICC is dependent on states ultimately, right? National governments to investigate crimes, to help to gather evidence, right? To secure evidence. If there's an actual conflict situation going on, right? I mean, the ICC prosecutor can't really send in, his own investigative team to try to find out what's going on unless somebody can militarily secure the area, right? Now, I mean, there's sort of different scenarios that you can imagine, right? The civil war in Colombia today, or if you want to call it a civil war, guerrilla war, whatever it is, right? It may be the case that the Colombian state has an incentive to help capture the drug lords, but they're unable to try them in their own court system, for example, because Colombian judges could be subject to assassination or kidnapping or having their families targeted if they try to try some of these people within Colombia, right? So in that case, you can actually imagine a lot of cooperation coming from the Colombian government to provide evidence to send these people to have them prosecuted in The Hague, where presumably the international justice legal system is somewhat more immune to the narco-trafficking, money and the reach of their power, right? There's other cases where, you're going to have out-and-out civil wars, or something like Yugoslavia, where until the conflict really comes to an end, it's going to be difficult for any kind of investigation to go forward, right? And the ICC will be dependent on intelligence from the major powers, like the United States, France, and countries that have satellites and that have extensive intelligence networks on the ground to collect evidence and find out what really happened, right? And that's actually another reason why it's important for the U.S. to join the ICC, is that it, in a sense, has more resources than other organizations. So you're right, there's this sort of need for cooperation, if you want, between a UN peacekeeping operation or UN enforcement operation and the ICC for them to succeed.
And I have another answer. Whoever it is who's alleged to have committed those crimes someplace else, and let's say that there's a Security Council referral and saying, yes, we want to try this person. Well, there's 97 countries where that person can't go. And if that person goes to one of those 97 countries, they have an obligation of cooperation to turn him or her over. And so that's one of the reasons that the more countries that are parties, the better it is, because there's going to be less places for these people to go where they can get away with it. And maybe they'll be stuck staying in their homes. That's fine. If they can't get out, there's no way to enforce it, so be it. It means that we won't be able to go in, but it limits the options for those people about what they want to do.
I mean, I support the ICC, and I think Bush is stupid for not continuing what they're doing. But my last question, the case of Sudan, are you going to do anything about that? Or?
The Sudan is not a state party to the treaty. And so the conduct that's occurring in the Sudan, the only way that that could be brought before the ICC is if there was a Security Council referral. That's one of the bad things about the U.S. being on the outside of this, because when the U.S. is on the outside of it, you will never get a Security Council referral. And so we certainly want to have all the 5 permanent members of the Security Council to be members. It's not that way right now. I have done quite a bit of research on the administration's reasons that they oppose the treaty, joining the treaty. I don't believe any of them are well-founded.
And the situation in Sudan and Darfur today is maybe not yet to the point where it's really appropriate for judicial action. I mean, clearly crimes have been committed, and hopefully someday someone will be in a position to prosecute them. But we're going to miss some things. Some conflicts are going to happen. Things happened before July 1st of 2002, right? The ICC has a limited budget, but I think it was 60 million euros the first year, and they've got 70 or 80 million euros next year. And unfortunately, there's enough war crimes and genocide in the world to go around. It would be more interesting, I think, or in a sense more important, to see how well the ICC does in dealing with Uganda and Congo and the cases that it is able to deal with, rather than sort of worrying about the whole of Sudan and Iraq that are still out there, places where the ICC but hopefully, someday everybody.
Our question, the first part is how effective and valid would the ICC be in terms of legitimacy and jurisdiction in the international community if superpower nations such as the U.S. is not on board? And the second one, you did a comparison between Vietnam and the U.S., how they're both not on board with the ICC. So in that terms, if a big powerful nation like the U.S., who's not supporting ICC, why should we expect a lower third world country like Vietnam to be in support of it?
Put his map back on.
Because it sort of shows, right, the amount of international support that there is for the treaty. And one interesting thing that you notice if you start to look at this map is that a lot of states that agreed to join the ICC are places that have seen conflicts of one sort or another in the last 10 or 20 years, like a lot of West Africa, right, or a lot of Central Africa, the Lake region, or all of Latin America, right, which experienced brutal dictatorships. And, one of the motivations behind this is that they know that their own legal systems are not always that secure. They don't have the benefit of a legal system like we have in the United States that functions pretty well most of the time, right, that can hold their own political leaders responsible. So they see this as sort of a stopgap. If you have a president or a dictator, in effect, that is prepared to try to use the law or use the power of the state to avoid their own selves, being brought to justice, then this international mechanism is sort of a way to protect themselves against that. So in those societies, the court has a great deal of legitimacy, I think, even without the U.S. being part of it, right? But clearly, it would have more legitimacy, if the U.S. would agree to play by these rules too. Now, it's not all bad in the sense that the United States, still subscribes to international law, we believe, for the most part. Now, some of the things that have happened under the current administration, right, leave us to wonder. But even under the Bush administration's, Department of State, right, they make an effort day to day to justify their conduct in terms of international law. Right? They haven't rejected international law out of hand. Right? They claim they're in compliance with the Geneva Conventions in Cuba. Now, I think they're not. I think you can argue that. But it at least it allows you to enter into a discourse with the administration and argue about them, right? If they accept the validity of the concept.
I'm not really going to answer your question, but you've given me a segue. You talked about the lack of U.S. support and what that might mean to other places. Well, Mike talked briefly about the so-called American Servicemen's Protection Act, Service Persons Protection Act. There's another amendment that was proposed this last summer called the Nethercutt Amendment. Mr. Nethercutt is, I think, a representative from the state of Washington, if I recall. And the American Servicemen Protection Act cut off military aid to countries that would not agree to Article 98 or bilateral immunity agreements with the United States. In other words, not to turn over U.S. citizens. And as an aside, those Article 98 agreements don't just say U.S. diplomats or U.S. military. They say U.S. citizens, so that if a soldier of fortune, a mercenary, is caught in those foreign countries, they have to be returned to the United States and not turned over to the ICC. But the Nethercutt Amendment takes it a step farther. The Nethercutt Amendment cuts off aid that's not of a military nature. It cuts off aid from a fund that's supposed to be going to increase cooperation on security and anti-terrorism efforts to countries that don't sign bilateral immunity agreements. Now, to me, that makes no sense. We were engaged in a campaign against terrorism, and we want everyone to support us, but we're going to cut off money to people who are willing to work with us if they won't agree to these bilateral immunity agreements. So, the short answer to your question is, yes, it would be a lot better if the U.S. was supporting this, but in fact, the U.S. is doing something against this. So, one of the things I would like from each of you, after you leave here, is to contact your congressman and say, what is this Nethercutt Amendment, and why are we punishing